should have turned back the moment I lost cell service. The road stretched endlessly before me, a narrow path of ice and packed snow cutting through an ocean of towering pine trees. My rental car's tires crunched over the frozen ground, the only sound in a world gone silent. No streetlights, no signs, just the pale glow of my headlights struggling against the thickening snowfall. I checked my phone again. No bars. Just a blinking no service in the corner of the screen. Great. James, the Airbnb host, had sent me directions in an email, emphasizing that GPS wouldn't work this far north. I had memorized his last message before I lost signal. Follow the road until you see the red cabin. Get there before sundown. And remember, read the rulebook on the counter when you arrive. A strange thing to say, but maybe it was just a quirky Alaskan hospitality thing. The trees began to thin out, and then, finally, I saw it. A small, red cabin nestled at the edge of a frozen lake. Smoke curled from its chimney, barely visible against the slate-gray sky. The whole scene looked like something out of a postcard, if that postcard had a slightly unsettling, abandoned feel to it. I pulled up beside the cabin and cut the engine. Silence. Not the kind of silence you get in a quiet room, but something heavier, almost unnatural. There was no wind, no rustling of branches, just the sound of my own breathing as I stepped out into the knee-deep snow. The cabin was smaller than I expected, with a dark wooden door and a single window with closed curtains. A thin layer of frost covered the edges of the glass. The trees stood tall and unmoving around it, like silent sentinels. Something about this place felt off. I shrugged it off. I was overthinking things. It was just the isolation getting to me. I grabbed my bag and walked up to the porch, my boots leaving deep impressions in the snow. The wooden steps creaked beneath my weight. I reached for the doorknob, but before I could turn it, the door swung open on its own. James stood in the doorway. He was an older man, maybe in his late 50s, wrapped in a heavy coat that looked like it had seen better days. His face was weathered, lined with deep creases, and his eyes, sharp and alert, studied me carefully. "You made it just in time," he said. His voice was rough, like someone who had spent a lifetime speaking over the wind. He stepped aside, motioning for me to enter. The cabin was warmer than I expected, the fire in the stone fireplace crackling softly. It was small but cozy, wood-paneled walls, a single armchair, a small kitchen area, and a narrow hallway leading to what I assumed was the bedroom. A single lamp bathed the space in a dim, golden glow. James closed the door behind me, then walked over to the wooden counter near the kitchen. Without a word, he picked up a thin booklet and placed it in front of me. "Read this before you do anything else," he said. I glanced down at the cover. Cabin Rules. The title was handwritten in bold, uneven letters. The pages looked old, edges slightly curled, as if it had been handled too many times. I chuckled nervously. "What is this, some kind of welcome guide?" James didn't laugh. "Just read it," he said, his voice flat, "and follow every rule." I met his gaze, expecting to see amusement or maybe the hint of a prank, but his expression was unreadable. Before I could ask anything else, he grabbed his coat from the chair. "I have to go," he said. "Stay inside after dark. Lock the door by 9. And whatever you do," he hesitated, "if you hear anything outside at night, ignore it." Then, without another word, he stepped out into the snow and shut the door behind him. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the cabin rules booklet in my hands. Something told me this wasn't just a weird Airbnb quirk. Something told me I should have never come here. I tossed my bag onto the old wooden floor and stretched my arms. The cabin smelled of pine and something faintly metallic, like the lingering scent of a fireplace that hadn't been used in a while. Outside, the snow was falling steadily, covering the ground in a soft, white silence. James had left an hour ago, and with no service on my phone, I was completely alone. I didn't mind. That was the whole point of this trip: disconnect, unwind, and maybe get some good footage for my travel vlog. I walked over to the thick rulebook he had handed me. It sat on the small coffee table, staring at me like an unwelcome guest. The whole thing was ridiculous. I grabbed it and flipped through the pages again. 1. Lock all doors and windows before 9 p.m. 2. If you hear footsteps on the roof after midnight, ignore them. 3. Do not look outside after 3 a.m., no matter what you hear. 4. Keep the fireplace burning at all times during the night. 5. If you see someone standing in the snow, do not acknowledge them. I exhaled through my nose, shaking my head. This had to be some weird local superstition. I had heard of places with strange traditions, but this was next level. I checked my watch. It was 8:45 p.m. Guess I should follow the rules, huh? I muttered to myself with a chuckle. Even though I didn't believe in this nonsense, there was no harm in humoring it. I went around the cabin, securing the doors and windows. The wind was starting to pick up outside, making the old structure creak. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was just the age of the place. By the time I finished, the clock on the wall showed 8:59 p.m. Right on time. I lit the fireplace, the dry wood catching quickly, sending a warm glow flickering across the room. It made the space feel cozier, less eerie. I sat down on the couch, pulling my camera from my bag. All right, I said, hitting record. Night 1 in the Alaskan wilderness. No internet, no phone signal, just me and this creepy little cabin. And these weird rules, of course. I lifted the rule book toward the camera, smirking. I mean, come on. Don't look outside after 3 a.m. What is this, a horror movie? I laughed, shaking my head. Anyway, let's see how this goes. I'll check back in the morning. I turned off the camera and leaned back, listening to the fire crackle. The heat felt good against the cold seeping in through the old walls. The snowstorm outside was getting stronger, the wind howling like something alive. Midnight came faster than I expected. I was dozing off when I heard it. Footsteps. Above me. Slow, deliberate steps. The sound of boots crunching against the wooden roof. My body went rigid. It had to be snow falling from the trees. Or maybe an animal. A raccoon. A bird. Something logical. But no. These were footsteps. Heavy. Pacing back and forth, right over where I sat. I swallowed. My mouth suddenly dry. My eyes darted to the rulebook, still lying on the table. If you hear footsteps on the roof after midnight, ignore them. I sat there, gripping the couch cushion, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The steps continued, slow and measured, like someone, or something, was taking its time. I wanted to look up. I wanted to convince myself I was imagining things. But I didn't move. I didn't even breathe too hard. The steps circled above me, then stopped. Silence. I strained my ears, waiting for anything. Another step, a sound, a whisper. Nothing. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. The wind howled. Still nothing. I let out a shaky breath, forcing myself to relax. Maybe James had set this whole thing up as some elaborate prank. Maybe the old wooden roof was just settling in the cold. Yeah, that had to be it. But I wasn't laughing anymore. I stayed on the couch, staring at the flames, not daring to move. The air felt heavier now, like the room itself was holding its breath. Eventually, exhaustion won. My eyelids grew heavy, my body sinking into the cushions. The fire's warmth wrapped around me, pulling me down into uneasy sleep. Outside, the snow kept falling, and somewhere above me, something was waiting. The morning sun barely broke through the thick, gray clouds hanging over the mountains. I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I stepped onto the cabin's porch, my breath curling into the cold air. The snowfall from last night had settled into an untouched blanket, except for my own footprints leading to the door. That should have been reassuring, but wasn't. I could still hear those footsteps from last night, slow, deliberate, moving across the roof above me. The sound had clung to my thoughts like frost on glass. I tried to convince myself it had been an animal, maybe a raccoon or some bird seeking shelter. But deep down I wasn't sure. The cabin sat alone, surrounded by towering pine trees that swayed in the wind, their dark needles whispering against one another. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional groan of the wooden porch beneath my boots. Then I noticed something odd. Right above the cabin door, carved into the wood, were strange symbols. I hadn't seen them when I arrived. They were rough, uneven, like someone had scratched them into the wood with a knife. They didn't look like any language I knew. Triangles, lines, and spirals intersected in patterns that made no sense. I reached out to trace one of the carvings with my fingers. The wood felt colder there, almost unnaturally so. A deep, uneasy feeling settled in my chest. Had James put these here? Were they meant to be some kind of warning? I shook my head. Maybe I was just letting the isolation mess with me. I had spent too much time online reading horror stories about remote places like this. Still, I made a mental note to ask James about it when I saw him next. I turned away from the cabin and looked at the forest. That's when I saw it. A shadow. It stood between the trees, far enough that I couldn't make out details, but close enough that I knew it wasn't my imagination. The shape was tall, motionless, almost blending into the trees, like it had been standing there for a long time. A chill ran through me. I blinked, and the shadow was gone. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe it was a trick of the light. The trees played weird games with shadows, especially this early in the morning. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been watching me. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera, zooming in on the spot where the figure had been. Nothing, just trees, thick and uninviting. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. I turned and went back inside, locking the door behind me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A call from James. "You okay?" His voice was gruff, but there was something else in it. Something I hadn't noticed before. Worry. "Yeah," I said, glancing toward the window. I think I saw someone in the woods." Silence. Then James spoke, slow and careful. "Did they see you?" I hesitated. "I don't know. I don't think so." "What?" A long pause. "Just follow the rules, Carlo," he said finally. "No matter what." The call ended. I stared at my phone, my heartbeat drumming in my ears. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, sounding almost like a whisper. I suddenly wasn't sure if I wanted to stay here anymore. I had been sitting in the cabin for hours, staring at the rulebook James had given me. The more I read through the pages, the more absurd the instructions seemed. Lock the doors by 9 p.m. sharp. Do not look out the windows after midnight. Never answer a knock at the door past 3 a.m., no matter what they say. It all felt so unreal. I mean, I was in Alaska, an Airbnb, not some haunted mansion or a forgotten bunker. Yet, something about the place had already started gnawing at me. The isolation, the cold, the strange symbols on the door. Even the eerie silence outside seemed too quiet, almost too perfect. But I wasn't going to let fear take over. I had a reputation to uphold, didn't I? My vlog was growing, and this was exactly the kind of strange content people love to watch. The more bizarre, the better. And if these so-called rules were meant to spook me, well, I was going to prove that nothing could faze me. That night, I decided to break the most obvious rule. I left the door unlocked after 9 p.m. I wasn't worried about it. Heck, I figured I'd get a good laugh out of the whole thing. Maybe I'd even film the moment and share it with my followers, acting like a brave fool who dared to test the absurdity of these superstitions. I clicked the lock shut at 8:58 p.m. just to see how long it would take for something to happen. I knew it was childish, but who cared? By 3 a.m., I had long forgotten about the door. I had been scrolling through my phone, checking my social media, and half-heartedly working on editing some footage from earlier in the day. My eyes were heavy, but I couldn't seem to sleep. Something about the night felt wrong. Then there it was. A soft, deliberate knock at the door. It was so light at first, I wasn't sure if I'd actually heard it or if it was just the wind. But then the knock came again, a little louder this time. 3 distinct raps, slow and measured. My heart skipped. I froze. I had ignored the rule. I had broken it. And now, I stood up slowly, holding my breath. I glanced at the door. The wooden frame seemed to almost creak, as if something, or someone, was on the other side. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice shaky, despite the bravado I tried to keep. The response came in a soft, gentle tone. "Carlo, let me in." My blood ran cold. How did they know my name? I hadn't told anyone, not even James, who only gave me the key and told me to follow the rules. Nobody should have known my name. I approached the door cautiously, keeping my back pressed to the wall as I moved. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the doorknob, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stop. But curiosity, foolish curiosity, pushed me forward. For a moment, I just stood there, my fingers hovering over the knob. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Carlo, open up. It's cold out here." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I suddenly felt so very small, like a child who had wandered into something they didn't understand. But in that instant, I realized I couldn't just ignore it. I had to see it for myself. I had to prove to myself that it was nothing, just some prank or a lost traveler who stumbled upon the wrong cabin. So, I took a deep breath and turned the knob. The door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing. The front porch was empty, bathed in the harsh, pale light of the moon. The snow was undisturbed, not a single footprint in sight. The air felt heavier out here, thicker, cold. I stepped outside, the bitter chill biting at my skin. The silence was suffocating, the kind that fills every corner of your mind with noise, the kind of quiet that makes you question everything. I turned back to the door, but as I did, something strange happened. The door slammed shut behind me, a loud, echoing thud that made me jump. I spun around quickly, the darkness around me swallowing the light. Something about the night felt different, like the air itself had shifted. A low whisper tickled the back of my mind. You shouldn't have opened the door. I rushed back, hands shaking as I grabbed for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. I was trapped outside. I didn't understand it. The rules, the warnings, they all seemed so simple. But I'd broken one, and now something had followed me into the night. And when I finally made it back inside, my thoughts raced with the realization that the door had never been locked. I had never actually turned the knob to lock it. It was as if something had been watching the whole time, waiting for me to slip up. And I'd done just that. And the worst part, I wasn't sure what would happen next. I woke up with a strange, nagging feeling, like someone had been watching me while I slept. It wasn't just the usual unease I'd been feeling ever since I'd arrived at the cabin. This was something different. I couldn't shake the tightness in my chest, the way the cold air seemed to have seeped deeper into my bones. I blinked hard, tried to clear the fog from my mind. It was early, too early, probably still a few hours before sunrise. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic crackling of the fireplace, barely keeping the chill at bay. My phone lay on the nightstand. Its screen cracked from when it had slipped from my hand last night, but it was still on. I checked the time. 3:15 a.m. That's when the memories of last night hit me. The knock. The voice. I hadn't imagined it. I had heard it clearly, echoing through the silence like a warning. But who could have been out there in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night? My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, glancing around the room. The cabin felt different this morning. The walls seemed closer, the shadows darker. I pulled the covers back and swung my legs over the side of the bed, the wood floor cold under my bare feet. My pulse was racing, but I couldn't just sit there. I needed to check things out. I grabbed my jacket off the chair and stepped into the living room. The fire had almost burned out, leaving the room bathed in a dim, orange glow. Everything seemed still, but that strange, oppressive silence hung in the air. I froze when I saw it. The furniture. It wasn't where I'd left it. The armchair was facing the opposite way, and the coffee table had been moved, just a few inches, but enough to make me uneasy. I hadn't touched anything when I came in last night, and James had specifically warned me to leave the place as I found it. I crossed the room quickly, checking the windows, the door. Everything was locked. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. But then I noticed something worse, the fireplace. I had stoked it just before I went to bed, making sure the logs were burning strong enough to last the night. Yet now it was completely out. The embers had died completely, leaving only a cold, ashy pit. I stepped closer to inspect it, but the air around me felt thick, like something was watching me from the shadows. I pulled away from the fireplace and went to the kitchen to get some water. The sink was empty, so I bent down to grab a bottle from the small stash I'd left on the counter. That's when I heard it again. A faint sound, almost like someone breathing. I stopped, the bottle halfway to my lips, and listened hard. Nothing. Just the cold hum of the cabin. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was the wind. I turned back toward the hallway, then froze. I'd left the door to the bathroom open last night. I always do have it, but now it was shut. I hadn't touched it since last night. The door was shut tight. I moved slowly, my heart in my throat. Something in the pit of my stomach told me that whatever had been in this cabin last night was still here. I couldn't explain it, but the air felt thicker, heavier. I reached for the bathroom door and gripped the handle. My hand shook, but I forced myself to turn it. The door creaked open, but all I saw was the dark, empty bathroom. Nothing seemed out of place. But then, something caught my eye in the mirror. I hadn't noticed it at first, but now it was impossible to miss. There, on the edge of the mirror, was a thin trail of dust, disturbed, as though something had brushed past it. But no one had been in here. I hadn't touched that mirror in days. I stepped back, my breath shallow, and turned toward the hallway again. That's when I saw the other mark. A set of deep, jagged gouges in the wall near the doorframe. Fresh. I didn't know what to think. There were no animals here. Nothing that could have done that. The walls were old, but they weren't rotting away. The marks were too precise. Then I heard it. A sound like nails scraping across wood, coming from the direction of the front door. I went still, every muscle in my body locking up. My first instinct was to run, but the second I thought about it, I realized the road out of here was miles away, and the snowstorm wasn't letting up. I was trapped. I stepped carefully toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I approached, the sound stopped. I hesitated, then reached for the door handle, slowly turning it. The door creaked open. There was no one there, but the cold hit me hard. A sharp gust of wind, carrying the smell of pine, and something else, something metallic. I stepped out onto the porch, looking around. No sign of anyone. Just the trees, the white mist hanging over the snow. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Something was watching. I turned back toward the cabin, but as I stepped inside, something stopped me cold. A pair of muddy footprints, too fresh, appeared just inside the doorway, leading up to the bathroom door. I backed away, my head spinning. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My legs felt like they were going to give out beneath me. I heard a voice then, faint, but it was there. I told you not to break the rules. I turned, but there was no one behind me. Just the dark cabin and the cold, silent air. I was not alone anymore. I can't explain why I didn't listen to James. Maybe it was the lack of sleep. Maybe it was my arrogance. Or maybe it was that nagging sense of curiosity that pushed me to ignore the warning signs. The cabin was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and settles there, like the walls were breathing out frost. I sat in a corner of the living room, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the sounds outside. The wind howled, rattling the windows, but something was different. The silence that followed wasn't like the usual stillness of Alaska. It felt like the quiet was waiting, like something was listening. It was past midnight when I first heard it again, the footsteps on the roof. At first, I tried to ignore it. It was easy enough to dismiss. The house was old, creaky. Maybe the wood was settling. But no, these weren't the sounds of a house stretching. These were deliberate. Heavy steps, slow and steady, pacing back and forth above me. The first rule was clear. Ignore them. Don't look. Don't move. I tried to focus on the screen of my phone, but my eyes kept darting to the ceiling. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I could hear something more now, something that sounded like breathing, shallow and ragged, right above me. It felt like the air in the cabin had thickened, like there was something pressing down on me from above, something that shouldn't be there. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. The rule book said to leave the door locked by 9 p.m. I had made the mistake of leaving it unlocked last night, but this was different. This was worse. Something about the footsteps felt personal, like whatever was walking on that roof knew I was here. It knew I was listening. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my brain. It's nothing, I whispered to myself, but the words didn't sound convincing. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This was wrong, a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet. My breath came out in shallow gasps, and I slowly backed away from the living room window, suddenly afraid to look outside. Something was waiting. I could feel it. Then came a knock, a soft, polite rapping on the door. 3 knocks, just like the rulebook said, but it was well past 3 a.m. The time for knocks had long passed. I froze, every muscle in my body tense like I was paralyzed by fear. Who would be knocking on my door in the middle of nowhere at this time of night? Who even knew I was here? I tried to tell myself it was James, maybe here to check on me. Maybe it was some weird Alaskan custom I didn't know about. But something deep in my gut told me I was wrong. I had already broken the rules. I had already done the one thing I wasn't supposed to do. I swallowed hard and stepped toward the door, my hand hovering over the handle. Don't open it. The rule book flashed through my mind. The words were like a chant, like a mantra. Don't open it. But I wasn't thinking straight. I had already crossed that line. I turned the handle. Slowly. The door creaked as it opened, and I stepped into the cold night air, my heart racing. I squinted through the darkness, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was nothing, no one, just the thick Alaskan night, the wind howling through the trees, and the snow crunching underfoot. But then I heard the voice. "Carlo, let me in." The voice was calm, too calm, and it wasn't James. I didn't recognize it at all. It didn't even sound human. My breath caught in my throat, and I slammed the door shut, the cold metal of the handle biting into my palm. I stumbled back, my hand shaking as I locked the door, double-checking the deadbolt. But that voice kept echoing in my head. "Let me in." I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was some local trying to mess with me. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. That voice had come from inside the woods, from a place far beyond where any person should have been at that hour. The cabin felt colder, the shadows deeper. I glanced nervously out the window. Nothing, just the empty dark. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there. Something was waiting, watching. Now they see me. I backed away from the door, turning in a circle, desperate for answers. That's when I saw the footprints. They were small at first, but they grew as they neared the window. They were freshly pressed into the snow outside, leading right up to the front door. The rules were never meant to be broken. I had seen enough to know now, but it was too late. They were here, and they weren't leaving. I collapsed onto the couch, my hands shaking violently, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps outside grew louder, closer. I tried to breathe, tried to calm myself, but I couldn't. I had crossed a line, and now I was trapped with whatever hunted this place. Now they see you, and they would never let me go. I sat there, staring at the phone in my hand, the screen flickering with James's number. The dial tone buzzed in my ear as the seconds stretched longer than they should have. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that made every creak of the floorboards and the soft groans of the cabin feel too loud, too real. The storm outside raged with no sign of letting up. The snow hammered against the windows, and I shivered. I wasn't cold. No, it was a deep, unsettling chill that seeped into my bones, creeping into my mind. I had already broken a rule, and now I felt the weight of the others bearing down on me. The phone clicked, and James's voice crackled through, rough and clipped. "Carlo," he said, his tone low, almost like a warning. "I'm not going to tell you again. Follow the rules, or you won't make it out of there." I leaned forward, my hands trembling just slightly. "What do you mean? What's going to happen if I don't?" There was a long pause, too long. I could almost feel his stare through the phone, sharp, calculating. When he spoke again, his voice dropped to a whisper. "They know you see them now. They're watching." I swallowed hard. "What do I do?" "What?" "Don't look in the mirror tonight, Carlo. Don't you dare." The line went dead. The phone beeped twice before going silent, leaving only the hum of the cold, the wind, and my thumping heart. I put the phone down slowly, my mind racing. Don't look in the mirror? What kind of rule was that? I thought I had seen it all. The shadows, the whispers, the footsteps. But now this felt different. The kind of threat that twisted your mind and made every rational thought slip away. I stood up, pacing the room, my shoes scraping against the old wooden floor. The fireplace crackled weakly in the corner, the flames fighting to stay alive. I glanced at the mirror across the room, the one next to the door. It was a small, old thing, the kind you'd find in some dusty antique shop. I had passed it 100 times without giving it a second thought. But now my eyes kept drifting back to it, like it was calling me. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's fragile walls, and the temperature inside seemed to drop another degree. I walked to the window, peeking through the frost-covered panes. The world outside was swallowed by a white blur, the trees barely visible through the snowstorm. A thought crossed my mind. What if James was lying? What if he was just trying to scare me into leaving early, to get me out of the cabin? My skepticism flared up again, fighting against the creeping sense of dread. But then, the thought returned. Don't look in the mirror. The words were heavy now, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I turned back to face the room, and that's when I noticed it. The mirror, staring back at me like it had a life of its own. It was only a few steps away, but it felt miles. The closer I got, the colder the room seemed to become, and the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stood in front of it, my reflection staring back at me, my breath fogging up the glass. The chill that had settled deep within me flared into a burning sense of urgency. I was fighting it now, fighting the pull to just look, just to see if it was anything more than a normal reflection. I closed my eyes. For a second, I stood there in the stillness, just breathing, trying to calm my heart. But I could feel it. The air thickened. There was something wrong. I opened my eyes. My reflection, it wasn't moving the way I was. For a split second, I thought my vision was playing tricks on me, but then it happened again. My reflection smiled, just a slight curl of the lips. I didn't. My body froze in place. The smile was wide now, creeping up in a way that wasn't possible. The reflection's eyes locked onto mine, and it was no longer me looking back. I couldn't tear my eyes away. My reflection stayed still, but it was grinning, watching like it knew everything I had ever done, everything I had ever feared. That's when I heard it. A soft, almost inaudible click. The door. It wasn't just the wind. Something was inside. I couldn't move. My legs were stiff. My breath caught in my throat. "Carlo." A voice whispered behind me. The tone was too familiar, too much like my own. It was low, soft, hungry. Before I could turn around, the lights flickered. The room was plunged into darkness. The mirror went black, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move inside it, something that wasn't me. I bolted to the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I reached for the handle. The cabin seemed to hum with a low, vibrating sound. I opened it, not looking back, and fled into the blizzard. Out in the storm, I couldn't tell if I was running from the mirror or if I was running from what I had already become. The rules weren't just warnings anymore. They were the only things standing between me and whatever was waiting to claim me. And now, I had broken the final rule. I don't know how long I've been awake. Hours, maybe more. The cabin feels colder than ever, the walls groaning in the night, as though they, too, are trying to hold something back. I keep telling myself it's just my mind playing tricks. But every time I glance at the window, I swear I see something, someone, standing just beyond the trees. The door creaks open, and I freeze. My heart pounds so hard, it feels like it's going to explode right out of my chest. My hand reaches for my phone, but I can't even bring myself to turn the screen on. The air is too thick with dread. Then I hear it, the sound I've been praying wouldn't come. A knock, soft, measured, as though whoever is outside knows exactly how to make me feel like I'm losing my mind. The knocking grows louder, more insistent. I fight the urge to scream, to run. But I know I can't. James warned me. The rules. Always the rules. "Carlo." The voice comes from outside, low and raspy, like it's being dragged across broken glass. "Let me in." I stay perfectly still. I remember James's words. Never open the door after 3 a.m. No matter what. But everything inside me wants to open it. Wants to see what is out there. The fear pulses through me, sharp and electric. I tell myself it's probably just the wind or my mind running wild. But there's something in that voice, something I can't ignore. Suddenly, I hear the faintest scrape, like nails against wood. The sound is so close now, just inches from my ear. I press my hands to the sides of my head, as though I could push the noise out. My eyes snap to the door. The knob is slowly turning. I back away, my feet stumbling on the floor. It feels like the walls are closing in, like I can't escape. I'm trapped. A soft breath escapes my lips. "James, help me," I whisper. But I already know it's too late for that. I broke the rules. Then, out of nowhere, the door bursts open. I jump back, my legs weak beneath me. Through the doorway, I see a man. Or at least, that's what my brain tells me it is. A man, tall and wide, dressed in dark clothes that blend into the night. His face is shadowed, unrecognizable, but there's a coldness in the air around him that makes my skin crawl. He steps inside, slow, deliberate, as though he has all the time in the world. His boots crunch against the wooden floor, each step echoing in the silent cabin. My breath hitches. I don't want to look, but I can't stop myself. He doesn't say anything. He just stands there, staring at me with eyes I can't see, but somehow feel. His gaze is so intense, it feels like it's cutting into me, digging beneath my skin. I can't breathe. I can't think. It's as if the world outside the cabin no longer exists. There's only him and me. Then, like a miracle, I hear the sound of a truck engine. It's faint at first, like a distant rumble, but it grows louder. My heart races. I know that sound. I know that voice. Carlo. James's voice cuts through the silence, rough and urgent. I turn toward the door, where he's standing in the doorway, holding a shotgun in one hand, his other hand gripping the frame for support. Get up, he commands. Now. I don't think. I don't hesitate. I rush toward him, but before I make it halfway, the shadowy figure moves. It's a blur, too fast to follow, but I feel it closing in behind me like it's just waiting for me to make one wrong move. Go, James shouts again, stepping forward, raising the shotgun. But I don't wait. I turn and run. I don't know how I make it outside. My legs are shaking, and I'm sure I'm going to collapse any second, but I keep running, fueled by pure panic. Snow crunches under my feet, the freezing air biting at my skin. I hear footsteps behind me, the sound of someone, or something, following close behind. I don't dare look back. James reaches me before I even realize it. He pulls me toward the truck, throwing open the passenger side door. He pushes me in, slamming it shut. He jumps into the driver's seat, and in one swift motion, the engine roars to life. We speed off down the narrow, snow-covered road, leaving the cabin behind. I can't breathe. I can't think. My heart is still pounding, my mind racing. James, what the hell was that? I gasp, turning toward him, desperate for answers. But he doesn't answer right away. He's staring ahead, his face pale in the dim light from the dashboard. You weren't supposed to break the rules, he mutters, his voice low and strained. Now they know you see them. I don't understand what he means. My head spins. We drive in silence, the truck bouncing over the rough road, but all I can hear in my mind is the sound of that knock. That voice. The thing that was inside the cabin. The thing that isn't finished with me yet. As we near the town, something strange happens. I glance at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see nothing but the empty road behind us. But instead I see it. In the reflection, behind me, I see a face. Pale, twisted, smiling. The thing is still with me. Still watching. I gasp, spinning in my seat, but there's nothing there. James doesn't seem to notice. He's still focused on the road, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. You're safe for now, he says, his voice barely a whisper. But they'll be watching. And just like that, the world goes dark. I sat in my apartment, staring at the screen. The harsh glow of my laptop made my eyes burn, but I couldn't tear myself away. My hands trembled as I clicked through the footage from my stay in that cursed cabin. I had to know. I had to see it all again, piece together what had happened. Maybe I could find an explanation, something logical. But as the footage played back, the unease that had settled in my gut that night crept up again, heavy and cold. At first, it was all the same. The usual shots, me setting up my camera, talking to the lens, making dumb jokes about the isolation. I laughed it off back then, playing it up for the viewers. But now, watching the footage in silence, I could feel the weight of the air in those shots. The stillness. The way the cabin seemed to hold its breath, watching me.